Good evening, Noswetha, and thank you for joining us for Hay Festival's book club. The book club is supported by Unwin Charitable Trust, and this month's particular event is in partnership with Words of Colour. The Hay Festival is, of course, a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. Now, before I talk to you about all that we've got to look forward to this evening, and I can promise you it'll be a fabulous evening, fingers crossed, I am going to ask you to reach for your diaries and make a note of next month's book club. So April's selection is the rather wonderful Metamorphosis by Kafka. All of the details are currently online, so I would encourage you to have a little Google and sign up as soon as we're done with today's session. And much like with this month's selection, books can be purchased through the Hay Festival's website, or you can, of course, support your local bookseller. Now, I should have introduced myself, shouldn't I? My name is Megan Davies, and I'm a rather groggy journalist from Swansea. I'm going to have to ask you for your forgiveness in advance this evening, because I do have a dose of the sniffles, but you'll be glad to know that you're not going to be hearing too much from me this evening. I am here purely to quiz a rather wonderful Welsh writer about her rather wonderful award-winning collection of stories. At the end of our session, there will be an opportunity for you to do the same. You've sent your questions in as part of this month's book club, so a big thank you, diolch yn fawr. They are brilliant, and I promise we will come to them later on in the session. So, without further ado, joining us this evening is Rachel Trezise, an award-winning novelist and playwright from the Rhondda Valley in South Wales. Her writing includes her debut novel, In and Out of the Goldfish Bowl, as well as plays Ton o Pandemonium. I've been worried about saying that all day. Ton o Pandemonium, We're Still Here, and Cotton Fingers. But the focus of our attention today is, of course, her collection of short stories. Here is rather lovely, Fresh Apples. Now, I originally wrote, as I prepared for this evening, that this collection is a love letter to people and place. And yes, while it might be a love letter, it neither romanticises nor sugarcoats what it means to live and learn in that rugged and raw corner of the world. In 11 stories, some of which are semi-autobiographical, Trezise takes us as readers up and down the valleys of South Wales, allowing us to peer behind the curtains of the people who populate them. And while her characters are so often funny, they are comical and they are very real, they are also the subject of pain, poverty, and intergenerational trauma. She writes, and I'm going to quote you now, Rachel. The tallest thing in Porth was the derelict Corona Pop factory at 3 stories. It was the gateway town to the Rhondda Valley, a valley of closing down coal mines and despairing redundant men. Not much like America, not New York at any rate. Maybe a little like the Wild West. It's booze-soaked men fighting, unshaven in the streets, old blues music pumping out of pub air vents. To live and hardly ever leave a place where the world was something that happened elsewhere invariably meant that elsewhere was Manhattan, the setting for a million zillion films, the setting for a real proper life. Now, it was originally published in 2005, and Fresh Apples went on to win the Dylan Thomas Prize before going on to be republished in 2020. And while life has changed so drastically for all of us collectively in those 15 years, it is hard to imagine that the people written about in these stories would be anywhere else, or could be anywhere else, other than the valleys of South Wales. And even if they were, even if they had relocated, readers of this collection will know that the coal-filled landscapes they left behind would tug at their heartstrings, a certain Welsh hiraeth, so beautifully depicted between the covers of this book. I'm going to stop blabbing now. Rachel Trezise, thank you so much for creating this world and for sharing it with us this evening. Croeso.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Amazing.
Oh, well, I've loved reading it, and so much so that I was talking about it on the weekend as if they were actually real people. So if anybody is joining us this evening who've sort of purchased the book and haven't got round to reading it yet, that's my review. They've got to get on with it. It's amazing. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, I've just mentioned that it was first published in 2005, winning then the Dylan Thomas Prize in 2006. And it feels like such a long time ago, but actually the stories feel so fresh, so relevant, as if they could be written about today. And I just wonder if you could give us an insight into what these stories are about. I know that's a big, broad question because there's so much to cover, but what are we talking about when we talk about Fresh Apples?
I think we're talking about young people growing up in a in a place that's difficult to grow up in, because I think it used to be that there would be jobs sort of waiting for you. And I think the people who were growing up around me didn't have that security and didn't really know what they were facing. So that, I think all of the stories cover that in one way or another.
And did you plan for this collection to be a collection? Sort of what's its origin story?
Sort of halfway through, so when I had about 5 stories, I thought it could be a collection. I'd finished, and my first book had been published, and it was an autobiographical novel. And it got quite a bit of attention, and I got myself a London agent, and they were telling me to write the next novel, but really I had no idea how to structure or plot a novel, and I didn't have a story. The first story was natural and was there for, and the second one I didn't know where I was going. I kept starting new books, getting 3 chapters in, and then like aborting them, not knowing what I was doing. But in the meantime, I got commissioned to write a few stories, one from Hay Festival, the Scripture Giovanni project, and then Big Issue Cymru as well used to commission 3 short stories, I think, over the summer. And over a period of 3 years, I'd written 3 stories for them and wrote one of my own off my own back. And I was sort of halfway through, and I kept asking my publisher, please publish my short stories. But short stories weren't fashionable at the time. And he kept telling me that a collection of short stories was something you collected over 40 years, not over 4 years. But I enjoyed writing them so much, I carried on. And soon I had 10 or 11 stories. I went back to him and begged.
And obviously, Fresh Apples is the first story in the collection, and that then lends itself to the title. Why Fresh Apples as a title?
That wasn't my choice, that was the publisher's choice. So I wanted to call the book The Joneses. I think The Joneses was the first or the second short story I wrote for the collection. And I was really fond of it. I thought that's where I sort of realized I could write a short story. So I was really fond of the story, and I thought the title The Joneses said something about the Rhondda and people and place. But the publisher didn't agree. It wasn't flashy enough. So I don't like the title Fresh Apples. I argued with him for a while about it, but he won.
And obviously there are so many themes that we will inevitably go on to discuss and unpick, but what was it that inspired you to write this collection? Because obviously you've said you were drawn to the kind of form, the appeal of the short story, but what inspired you for the content?
Just just because I was battling with trying to find that big, huge novel story. But what I already had from growing up was lots of little stories and lots of rumors and lots of gossip that and characters, people in the Rhondda, there's so many characters, they want to come and tell you stories. So I had all these little stories that wouldn't fit into a novel, but work perfectly as short stories, or maybe like monologues, or like a long joke, like kind of stand-up stuff. So that's what inspired me, really. I had ideas.
And I mentioned in the introduction that some of the stories have autobiographical elements. They are fiction, but they have elements of your own life. The characters themselves, are they real people? Are they inspired by people that you knew?
I think it's like they're amalgamations of people that I knew or still know, and quite a lot of it is me as well. I would say it's sort of 50% real, based on reality, and 50% made up. And then, some characters are just like a mixture of somebody I know vaguely and somebody I know really well. It's all just a mixture of growing up here.
I always think that if I were to write about where I came from, there would be a sense of sort of vulnerability putting those stories out into the world. And I'd probably be a little bit nervous about sharing that part of me. And I wonder, what was that like for you to put your sort of your home and your people out there? How did that feel?
I think because sorry, my cat is trying to muscle in. I think the first novel was I'd gotten over that because that was so personal. It was kind of like a thinly veiled memoir, really. So because that was out in the world and people had received it well, I wasn't that concerned about the short stories. I really didn't care. I mean, I wish I was a bit more sensitive. Like sometimes I'll read something that I wrote when I was young now, and wish I had the editing skills that I have now. But I quite enjoy the rawness as well. No, it was like, just all in.
And we know, of course, that this collection was critically acclaimed, but what about the locals? How did they feel about seeing that the Rhondda Valley on paper?
Well, some people loved it. Yeah, like young people loved it. People my own age and younger would say they recognised what was on the page, but older people didn't like it. A few people really disliked it. A few local journalists really hated it, hated the way I was portraying the Rhondda Valley, and maybe thought I was projecting too much of my own life and my own experience of the valley on their experience of the valley, kind of thing.
We know that you still live in the area now, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the Rhondda in itself sort of feels like a character in this collection. Lots of your characters, they sort of talk about maybe leaving, some actually do, some dream of leaving. And sort of a few of them talk as well about sort of dreaming about life beyond the mountains and sort of being locked in geographically. I wonder what you would say to that. Did you intentionally sort of weave those themes in?
Yeah, because it was that was my life at the time. I had a love-hate relationship, but well, no, I think now I've still got a love-hate relationship. But at the time when I was younger, I sort of hate was winning over. I really wanted to go out and experience some of the world, and I felt the Rhondda was holding me back. So that's why those themes are present. Um, yeah, yeah. So it wasn't intentional in that. That was a theme I wanted to cover. That was just there very much innately in me.
Yeah, and again, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that actually it's a reflection of sort of politically and socioeconomically what many people think about as well, isn't it? Do they have to leave to have a different kind of life and seek new jobs and that sort of opportunity as well?
Yeah, and I think it extends outside of the Rhondda as well. I think if you live in quite a small place, inevitably you want to get out and see somewhere else, you know.
Definitely, definitely. By setting your story in this particular part of the world, there is obviously a particular way of speaking. The dialogue, the vernacular that you choose to use is so unique to that area. And I've sort of, these are characters I've sort of grown up listening to. I'm not from the same part of the world as you, but I could hear so many people that I knew in your dialogue. And I wonder what that was like for you as a writer to be able to sort of write your own way of speaking into literature.
Yeah, it's lovely actually. And I didn't pay any attention to that actually. It came so naturally. But it's when I look back now I and when I write Welsh dialogue now, I see how privileged I was in being able to do that, really. Um, I love people's reaction to it as well. Like people love to hear me reading it because obviously a lot of people can't imagine what the dialogue sounds like. So it's strange, but when I was writing this book, everyone who I knew spoke like that. I heard other than on television, hadn't heard any other kind of dialogue. So that was my life.
And yet, while you might have seen it on the telly, I don't think it's unfair to say that you probably haven't read much of it in other novels, other short collections.
No, definitely not.
Does
No.
does that come with a certain amount of pressure as someone from the area to be sort of like speaking on behalf of your people and your community?
No, I would never put that pressure on myself. Like a few articles have come out or where people have said I'm the voice of the valleys, and I hate that. I'm not the voice of the valleys. It's just my voice talking about myself. Like a lot of my work is quite over the top, like going into magic realism and science fiction and stuff. So I mean, I would never say that. The voice of the valleys is Tom Jones, obviously.
And he does get a couple of references, to be fair, in the collection. I don't think you could write a collection of short stories about the area without mentioning him once or twice.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to ask you to talk to us a little bit as well about the Welsh language in particular, because whilst this is obviously English literature set in Wales, you have you have included the Welsh language in so many of your stories. And I'm thinking, for example, of some characters who use it to sort of who use the language to protect others. They speak in Welsh when they don't want others to understand. There are then characters who are quite dismissive of it and don't, don't sort of compliment it as a language. Why did you choose to weave the Welsh language through your stories?
That's just how it is in the valley. So I wanted like just with as well as being true to the dialogue I hear, I wanted sort of the attitude towards the Welsh language, the true like to be realistic to the area. So those are all opinions and ways of treating language that I heard growing up.
Do you think it would be different now if you were to write it now because of the way sort of the Welsh language is championed now in comparison to 2005?
Yeah, I think those characters that were dismissive of it would be a lot less dismissive of it. Although there is, like in the older generations, there's still a little bit of that around in this area. Yes, and it would be more positive, but and there'd be more of it, I think.
Mm. And it's also really refreshing, sort of from a very basic level to see the two languages coexist in such a natural way, because so many of your characters sort of weave it in without realizing that they're dropping Welsh words into an otherwise all English sentence.
Yeah, it's the way people speak, and I just love it. I like recently I did a very short play for like a new version to celebrate Under Milk Wood's 80th anniversary, is it? Or maybe the 70th anniversary. I wrote a mini Under Milk Wood set in the Rhondda, and the producers from Radio 3 said to me that they wanted that they recognised that that was the way people speak in Wales, strands of all different languages and cultures, and they wanted as much of that as possible. And it was just like being a kid in a sweet shop, knowing that I could throw in all, all the Welsh and all the yes mouths.
It would be, yeah, it would be weird without it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about form, and you've talked about it a lot as the appeal of a short story and the ability to tell these jokes, these rumours, these bits of gossip in sort of a compact form. But the art of it, I suppose, is that in those short stories, in just a few pages, so often in this collection, you take on massive themes of poverty, inequality, abuse, all of these different things that are references to alcoholism and drug addiction. Um, and I wonder, did you set out to tackle all of these topics, or did you just find that they were the sort of things you were turning to naturally as you told the story of your community?
They just found their way in. Um, Again, I wouldn't pressure myself by telling myself, right, this must be a huge theme. You must cover, these three themes in this story. It's just stuff that comes in incidentally, really, and it's whether it makes like the edit or not. People always say there's so much in there, but that was never my intention, really. I mean, I think the genius of being a really good short story writer is brevity and like editing it, as drastically as you can. I always think the best short story writers are like ones who can tell a really good story in 600 words, and I'm not like I couldn't get it down, that low. Yeah, it's just accidental.
Well, I think you're doing yourself a disservice there. I don't know how accidental it is. I mean, I've just made a note now. I was looking back through my notes, like the story, for example, but not really. In that story, you're looking at class, privilege, manipulation, abuse, control, underage relationships, and what is that in a couple of hundred words?
Yeah, so I don't know. That just comes with fully rounded characters, I think. If you know your characters well, they bring all this baggage themselves. So it's.
How much sort of preparation do you put into fleshing those characters out? Because it's a lot of work for a short amount of writing. What do you sort of plot their backstory as you go into writing the story?
No, no, I never do that with a short story. I mean, when I write a novel, I've got reams and reams and reams of character history. But that's what I love about short stories. You can just go in with what's in your head.
And how does the editing process work in that then? Is because like, you must sort of put it on the page, but then you have to go back and add in those details and the amazing things that sort of the amazing detail that flesh those characters out.
It's usually about taking it out. It's all there in the first draft of the short story. And then you have to go back and polish it up and take out what isn't necessary.
Amazing. I think you're being far too modest. I read one of the stories, and incidentally, for people who have read this story at home, one of the characters is called Megan Davies, which really freaked me out a little bit. And I couldn't. It made me realise that I couldn't read more than one story at once, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, but I had to put it down after reading each story to sort of process what had happened and what she'd been through and what was potentially going to happen to her when the story had come to an end in my head. And I wonder, what was that like for you to write? Because they're not easy themes, are they? They're not easy topics.
I can't really remember, to be honest with you. I think I enjoyed writing those stories so much. I think it must have been a bit of relief. I think I must have been holding quite a few people's pain in my hands for quite a while because I wrote them easily and I was glad to have written them. So no, it was never difficult. It was never a task to deal with those themes.
Did you find it to be a cathartic experience?
Yes, I did, but not as much as the first novel. As I said, because the first novel was such a difficult story, everything in comparison seemed quite easy. So
That's amazing. And I touched on this earlier with regard to the Welsh language, but obviously this was written in 2005 and so much has changed. And I asked you about how maybe the attitude toward Welsh would have changed. But if you were to write the collection as a whole now, would it look different in 2024?
well, I think like politically and technologically, it would uh, be different, but in essence, probably no. I mean, like people are still dealing with like the uh, long loss of industry, which just goes on, and the way people earn a living changes all the time, and the environment is changing drastically more quickly than it was then. But I know I think essentially the stories and the themes would kind of be the same.
So many of the things that you write about are intrinsically political, but I just wonder, would you describe yourself as a political writer?
No, I mean if I'm put on the spot, I always say I'm political with a small p. Yeah, I no, especially with the last novel as well, Easy Meat. People say it's a political novel, but the way my publisher tricked me into writing it was by telling me it's a novel about art, not about politics. Um, no, I think if I was made to write about politics, I wouldn't want to do it really. It just naturally finds its way into the literature.
And I suppose the question would be, would you be able to write short stories about this area and these people without veering into the topics that are so often political?
No. And also it's part of growing up here as well. Like everybody was discussing politics, like from the time of the miners' strike on. The thing they say about not discussing politics. So write a passage to discuss politics around the sort of dinner table in the valleys. So it wouldn't if you didn't talk about politics or mention it wouldn't seem right or realistic.
Yeah, what did someone tell me that in South Wales storytelling is a competition and politics is a rite of passage? That's you could definitely see that in this collection. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. I wanted to ask you about the women and the girls in this story. So the notes I've made here, you go from the fierce grandmother Blodwen in Chickens, and I'm going to quote you, and I hope this doesn't make you cringe, but you say, she's a feminist through and through, but if you had ever told her, she wouldn't have known what the word meant. And then you go from Blodwen to someone like Megan, who I've already referenced in the story Coney Island, and she's vulnerable and she's innocent, and ultimately she's abused and she's exploited. So you've got that real spectrum of age and experience and strength. And I wonder, was that important to you as you included these characters?
Yes, I really wanted them to be real women. That's the one thing I was aware of when I was about to set out writing it, was there's very few sort of female characters from the Rhondda written well. I mean, Rhys Davies writes women fantastically, but from a women's point of view, it just don't exist. And there's a whole range of types of women outside of the Welsh mam. So yeah, that was on my mind, that I wanted a lot of different kinds of female characters.
And I think I'm allowed to say this, but the women of the Rhondda are amazing, without sounding ridiculous. There are so many people you could meet out there.
They are.
I know I'm going to ask you a sort of disingenuous question here because I know the answer to it, but I'd love for you to share with the audience that Blodwen was inspired by your actual grandma.
Yeah, my grandmother was called Blodwen. It was a surprise when we were chatting on the phone this morning. And I told you that the characters in Chickens were based on my grandparents. And you said, were they called Danny and Blodwen? And I said, yeah, they were, but I couldn't remember that I'd actually called them that. Called them that in the story. Yeah, so Blodwen was my grandmother, and the character in Chickens is based on her.
And did she know that you'd written about her?
No, she was gone by the time I wrote that. So she died when I was 18, so she never saw me published. But she was the first person who told me, well, she never told me I would be a writer, but she kind of, there wasn't much encouragement in terms of books or writing. But she used to clean a pub, and she used to bring the writing paper home for me to write. So I think she picked up that I enjoyed writing quite young. And
What would she have said to see you a published author?
God, I don't know. I don't know.
I'm sure she'd have been thrilled. I obviously, we can't talk about the women without talking about the men. And I hope this is fair to say, but so many of the male characters in this collection are abusive. They are manipulative, and yet they exist against this backdrop of unemployment, of poverty, of intergenerational trauma, as I've already said, learned behaviours. And sort of, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is it's not as easy as it to say that the men in this collection are the bad guys. It's not that simple.
No. Well, no, just as I wanted the female characters to be realistic, I wanted the male characters to be like a mixture of all those things. Yeah, I mean, there's so much generational trauma, but also there's just bad people. I wanted it to be a mixture of those things, and also a couple of nice guys as well.
Do any of the characters beyond Blodwen and Danny, of course, do any of them sort of stand out for you looking back?
Matt from Fresh Apples. Because Fresh Apples is such a successful story, I used to read it. There was a point where I could have read it without holding a book in front of me. And I just, not at the time of writing it, but over a long passage of time of reading it, I fell in love with Matt and his vulnerability.
Yeah, it's that is quite the. I had to read that twice because I was so stressed about what had happened to him and was he okay and how did he remember things. And I'm not going to ruin it all for anyone who hasn't read it, but yeah, he is particularly brilliant, isn't he? The next thing I wanted to talk to you about was sort of the formation of relationships, because so much of what you write about, to generalize across the collection, is about how we treat each other, how our actions and our decisions affect other people. And I was thinking, I read the story again this morning of Ruth and Simon in the break fluid at Gina's. And I am going to quote you again. I'm sorry to keep doing this because I know how weird it must be, but you write about Ruth. She'd never really learned to handle men. She flirted with her customers, swindled them, measured them, but she'd done it all for profit. Simon had ensured that she never really got around to learning about real emotions. And I think what you do so well is you write about the innocence of people, but also the fragility that comes from forming those relationships. And are they stimulating themes to consider as a writer when you're talking about these people?
I think they were at the age I wrote it, because at that age, I was 22 or 23, and that's when you kind of form in all those really special relationships at that age. And so friendships and relationships change as you get older, but everything is so intense when you're that age. So it was, yeah, it was enjoyable to explore those themes at that age.
What do you think you sort of learned about people as you explored these characters and made decisions about their actions?
I don't know. I don't think I learned anything really. I think like people still surprise me now.
It's amazing. The other theme that really sort of stood out for me, and it was something that again kind of, I hope you don't mind me saying, but it seemed as if it came up in so many of the stories, was that your characters often told themselves stories to sort of self-soothe and comfort. So many of the characters, as I say, comforted themselves by telling themselves little white lies or manipulating the truth a little bit so that their own truth, their own story was maybe a bit more palatable. So I was thinking about the character Gemma, again in but not really, and you know, you've already mentioned Tom Jones, but she sort of says, right, that I'm Tom Jones's daughter. And the reason she brings that up is because it allows her to feel important, that in the blink of an eye, she can go to mentally to a party in LA and she can be this, she can have this status and have this protection. And I wanted to ask you about that idea of stories preserving us, the kind of the stories that we tell ourselves preserving us. How much did you consider that as you wrote your collection?
I didn't consider it really. It just would have been there as growing up in a place which is financially difficult, but how culturally rich it is with storytelling and music, and how how much that makes up for the bad stuff.
Mm.
Um, you carry that you carry that along inside you. So I definitely wanted that to be there in those characters.
Mm. And a lot of your characters, as I say, sort of tell those little white lies and manipulate the reality because it's the only way to cope for some of them.
Mm.
It's brilliant. There's a lovely quote as well that again I wanted to read, but it's a quote from the story Valley's lines, and you use a metaphor about a donut, which I think is just brilliant. And you say, it was stupid, really. She didn't even like donuts, only the jam in the middle. The dough was so heavy and tasteless, it was a relief to get to the jam. The jam was so good, you could forgive the dough. And just like life, of course, it knocked 10 shades of shit out of you before it gave you anything to smile about. And for me, as I read that quotation, it sort of just summed up the collection because so many of the things you talk about are really blinking heavy and they're traumatizing in so many ways. And yet, when you just about think that you can't cope with what these people are going through, there's this glorious moment of lightness and innocence and that jam, if you like. We really need that relief, don't we, when we're telling stories?
Yes, yeah. And some kind of dark humor. And however dark it is, there has to be some humor and lightness. Otherwise, why would you read? Why would you read otherwise?
And a particular, I think fair to say, a particular dark humor that is unique to the geography as well.
Yeah, so like I wanted everything about it to be authentic. Like I wanted the characters to be authentic. The humor had to be too. So I remember a lot of people accusing me of being dark for the sake of being dark. We writing is so dark. I was thinking, no, that's just the humor I was brought up with. It always was on the dark side. Um, because of the difficulty and the economic difficulty, people relied on humor.
Yeah, it's a currency as well, isn't it? Because it's something that people can use when they're telling their stories or that they're projecting themselves to their communities.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you as well to talk to us about class because it's sort of a theme and a topic that you can't really escape in this collection. Whether they're the people that have money, there are references to cars and cars driving into schoolyards and everybody noticing that I think it's a BM, isn't it, in the one reference. Could you have written these stories without class? It feels like such a silly question, but it's so pivotal to the connection.
Like probably not. But again, when I was writing it, I don't think I was aware of how much how much class I was writing down, like how many of those themes and mentions of it that were going in. They just happened to be there, I suppose.
Did you do any? I know you sort of referenced earlier the kind of bits of gossip and the snippets of stories that you'd heard here and there. But what did the research for this collection look like?
Nothing. There's no research, so it was just things you collect as somebody from South Wales valleys. You hear those stories being told over and over in the pub or around the dinner table, until it's a bit like Chinese whispers. They get bigger and they get more exciting. The places change, and you see how like a rumor turns into a story right in front of you. So that's what they are, really. They It's me writing it. It's like a Chinese whisper going through 5, 6 years, going around in rotation, and me finally writing it down.
And adding little details and yeah, making it brilliant. I suppose the top tip for any aspiring writers who might be joining us tonight is to always go to the pub then.
Yeah, like yeah, and public transport is great as well.
Do you keep a note?
I used to carry a notebook everywhere. Now I've got my phone, so everything is in my phone.
Yeah, I sort of like overheard snippets of conversation or something that might get you thinking, I imagine.
Mm. Well, I should say as well, I do use a lot of newspaper stories, especially for Fresh Apples. I used a couple of tabloid stories. So that character Gemma, in But Not Really, that comes from a story from the Sun or something, and I just put some Valley accents in there.
Yeah, she's amazing. So obviously the reference to her being Tom Jones's daughter makes it all the more pertinent. I mentioned earlier, of course, that this collection went on to win the Dylan Thomas Prize, and I wanted to ask you, what did that accolade mean for you, both as a writer to receive that recognition, but also projecting your work onto a larger stage?
Oh, it was huge, absolutely huge. So I just thought, so when I was longlisted, I thought, I'm the token Welsh author because the prize is set in Wales. They need a Welsh book. And then I got down to the shortlist. I didn't for 1 minute think I would win it. But I mean, when I did, part of the prize, it was a lot of money, but the other part of the prize was to be writer in residence in Texas University. So, I mean, what I remember most about all of that is talking to American students and them understanding the stories. I couldn't believe that they would get the valleys, but they did. A few of them said it's exactly like where I grew up. So at that point, I realized that if you're really, really detailed as a writer about a place, uh, that's what affects other people. That's how you get to other people.
And
When
did the way that they respond to the story differ at all from a Welsh reader? Did they pick up on things that maybe you hadn't sort of anticipated they'd pick up on?
No, no, I mean, I just didn't think that they would get any of it. Like any of it. Like understand, like, the Fresh Apples is about kids setting fire to the mountains. I really thought that was just like a Welsh thing that nobody would get outside of Wales. But they completely understood it. So
And there's the genius of the collection. And I know you'll disagree with me or you'll shake your head, but that is the genius of it, isn't it? And I suppose they could understand the innocence of youth and the boredom and the not having anything to do when it's boiling hot and that's what they that's what they would do. I suppose the obvious question to ask before we turn to the audience's questions is what's next for Rachel Trezise? What are you working on?
so I'm working on a novel. It's in a very like infancy, and two plays. So one is almost finished. It's a play about male sexual abuse, actually. It's called No Man's Land. It's a one-man play. And a second play, which is also a one-man play. And that's about jazz bands in the 80s in the South Wales valleys, jazz bands were really popular. So it's about where have jazz bands gone, and also about Freddie Welsh, the boxer from Pontypridd.
And when will we be able to see these plays?
I don't know, they're both in development. So one is at really the Freddie Welsh one is at a really early stage, and No Man's Land is nearly there. I'm just about to start the last draft.
Amazing. So watch this space for more Rachel Trezise works. Fantastic. And before we turn to the audience, I suppose that one of the questions I'd love to ask you is about Welsh stories moving forward. You mentioned earlier about there being a lack of well-written Rhondda women available to read and see and hear. Where do you see the gaps still? Where are the gaps remaining? What needs to be written?
Oh, I think it's much better now. So I can see the young people of today bringing out like collections set in the Rhondda, novel set in the Rhondda, which are absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure there are gaps, only that we still need more working class writing.
How do we make that happen?
Make sure that working class people are reading. Fabulous programs like Hay Festival have. But other than that, I don't know.
They're big
It's like
questions.
it's difficult to get published. I mean, especially at the moment, it's a really difficult time to get published. Publishers are really interested in celebrities and cooks and not so much in literature, and definitely not working class literature. So there's a gap there. There's a gate we need to open.
So anybody watching who's got a pen and a pad and an idea needs to get writing.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it. On that note, I think it takes us so nicely to the questions that were sent in by the audience. So I'm going to ask you a very pertinent question. This was sent in by Josh. And I think this lends itself nicely to what you've just been talking about, actually. Josh says, Rachel, you started your career at an early age. What advice would you give to other young writers starting out?
The problem is I'm really bad at giving advice. I don't trust my own advice, let alone to give it to anybody else. But just do it, just write, because I think there's so much. That's my only advice, really. If you want to write, just write. Write what you want to write. There's so much talk about what you should write, how you should approach it. Just write it first of all. Get a first draft down before you start worrying too much about if the content's right, if the language is right, if you're doing dialogue right. Just create something.
And I know you referenced your grandma Blodwen earlier, but were there any other champions in your life encouraging you to put pen to paper?
I had some really good English teachers in Treorchy Comprehensive. In fact, I saw I saw one of them yesterday, and I'd forgotten all about. But one of my old school friends put a picture of our old English teacher up and was talking about what fabulous work he'd studied with him, and it just all come flooding back, like how I'd done 1984 and Macbeth with him. His name was Mr. Lewis. And I can still remember, I just remembered last night looking at a photograph of him. I can still remember some of those conversations we had about politics and religion, talking about politics and religion, and how passionate and fiery that was when I was 14. So yeah, I would definitely say Mr. Lewis and Mr. Hughes, two fabulous English teachers.
Yeah, we all need good English teachers. They make a world of difference. And quite often people don't realise what sort of seeds are being sown at the time until you look back and think, blinking heck, that got me thinking. Brilliant. We've got a question then from Yeyan. And Yeyan says, you work across a variety of forms. What are the similarities in how you approach them all? And do you have a favourite?
So my favourite are short stories, just because I don't need to do so much research with them. I can hold a short story in my head easily. Can't hold, especially as I get older, my concentration's going. Can't hold a novel in my head. Need reams and reams of notes to remember characters' names, etc. But short stories are similar to playwriting 2 novels in that I always approach them as monologues. And I didn't even realize I was doing that until I became a playwright. So I think when I'm starting to plan a short story in my head, the first thing I do is imagine the main character's voice, and them talking about their life, maybe talking to themselves in their own bedroom in the dark. So that's how I get to know, the character before I start anything. So that's the same for playwriting and for fiction, really. But I didn't even realize I was doing that until I started writing plays.
So nobody taught you to do that. Nobody encouraged you to sort of think about it through that lens.
No, I just knew that to write characters authentically, I had to know them in my own head.
That's amazing. And on a really practical level, I'm just thinking about Jan asking about that approach. What does a day of writing look like for you? Do you have sort of a routine and a rhythm? Is there other things you have to do to get yourself into that zone, metaphorically and physically?
No, not really. I mean, if I get very few writing days, to be honest. I'm usually editing other people's work these days. But if I know I've got a writing day, I just start with my laptop on the settee at 7 in the morning, and I stop when I think I've written enough. All I bring is when I finish for the day is I write everything that's in my head at the time, notes, which I think will be useful for tomorrow. I write down before I close the laptop. And that's really helpful to get you going the next day.
To pick up where you left off.
Yeah.
And are you fueled by tea or coffee? Big questions here.
Or coffee.
Coffee all the way. Jessie has written in and asked, Rachel, which books or authors have inspired you the most?
So Maya Angelou was my favorite. And that's why I wrote my first book. So when I discovered I Know Where the Cage Bird Sings, and then I loved Toni Morrison, who I studied for A level, and also Annie Proulx. They're my 3 favorite writers.
And it's interesting because you say about you taking your stories to America and people in America being able to understand your story set in the valley, and yet the people who have inspired you are so distant geographically, sort of to what you knew and how you grew up, and yet you found something in them.
Yeah, I suppose that's that sort of that being a fan of that so much American writing taught me that really how like to write from to expect an international audience, maybe thinking you will never really get one, but just in case you do, you know.
And are there any voices, any sort of contemporary voices, or I hate this term, but up and coming writers, poets that you have got your eye on and you think they're going to do brilliant things?
Oh, you put me on the spot now. Um,
We can come back to that if we need to.
yeah, come back to that later. Let me have a little think.
We've got a great question from Alex, and Alex writes, the vulnerability of relationships and insecurity of youth are so important in these stories. Do you ever want to revisit your characters and explore what their lives would be like as adults?
No, that's the reader's job. I like to just leave them on the page and they go on to other people's minds then, I think. I never go back to them.
But honestly, Rachel, some of it's torture because I just want to know.
No.
Honestly, some of those characters, I was thinking about them. I was talking about them on the weekend as if they were real. What happened to them? Funny. We've got a question then from Bronwyn, who wants to know, what are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading lots and lots of books. I'm the fiction judge for the Welsh Book of the Year.
Oh.
So I'm reading lots and lots and lots of Welsh fiction.
And give us a little flavour. Lots of people at home will know who is on the list, but give us a flavour of what sort of themes people are writing about.
Oh, it's everything. I mean, it's so varied. So when you get the whole gambit, there's no filter judge. So everything which has been released in the last year I'm reading.
And
Genre fiction, everything. I mean, I'm reading a lot of things which I wouldn't choose myself to read, but it's great. I'm learning so much.
I was going to say that must be really healthy for you as a writer as well to be
It is.
exposed to those different kind of topics.
Yeah, it is.
What have you read that you've sat back and thought, oh, blinking heck, I wish I'd written that?
Oh, well, Thomas Morris, obviously. Thomas Morris short stories are fantastic.
So that maybe he's one of your voices moving forward.
Yes. Yes, although he's not that young, like he's won Welsh Book of the Year before. But this collection in particular, I really, really loved Opener.
Do you think that English literature in Wales is well recognised enough as a sort of centre for exciting new works?
No, I don't. I mean, it is exciting. There's lots going on. There's loads of exciting voices. It's just not getting picked up by English newspapers in the way that Irish fiction is at the moment.
Hmm. I wonder what is that the Sally Rooney effect? Is that why Irish writers are having such a moment? What's the secret?
Well, it may be, but I think that's always been the case as well. Like Irish and Scottish writers always tend to take the limelight.
You heard it.
Not through any fault of their own. I just think there's a disconnect between sort of English media and Welsh voices. I just think partly because of the dark humour we're talking about, something is missed. Something is not understood there.
Were you obviously when you won the Dylan Thomas Prize for this collection, were you interviewed by lots of sort of media outlets and journalists over the border? And if so,
Yes.
did you see a difference in how they sort of quizzed you on the collection?
Yes, I mean there was a few of them found it difficult to understand the geography of Wales. So Wales, to a lot of the broadsheet journalists who interviewed me, is just sort of Pembrokeshire. It's just like a holiday home. Not a lot of people understand how kind of unique the geography of the South Wales valleys is. They get that it's post-industrial, but they don't get that it's rural at the same time, or they get that it's rural and they don't get that it's post-industrial. They don't understand the mixture
Mm. Yeah,
and the diversity of Wales as a country, like how different North Wales is to South Wales and so on.
not even as an author, but as someone from that community, is there a certain frustration sort of that lends itself from that idea that the diversity of Wales isn't appreciated?
Yes. Yes.
In brief. In brief. We've got a question here, very conscious of the time, a question from Amir. And Amir asks, you embody a lot of different characters in this work. How do you approach writing different characters? And what do you enjoy about creating such varied protagonists? Big question.
Yeah. I just want to like produce varied work. I don't, of course, a lot of all writers' characters come from themselves, but I know I I'm conscious of not boring people by writing my own opinions and myself over and over again. Um, just want to make sure I'm taking in a bit more of the world around me and representing as much as I can other genders, other experiences, as much as I can.
Yeah. And it's hard, isn't it? Because I was going to say it leads me to a question around sort of where you go to for your inspiration, because so often we can romanticize what it means to be a writer and envisage this really sort of, as I say, this like romantic life, but actually it's a job and it's a discipline and you have to get up every day and do your work. But where do you go when things are feeling a bit dry and you need a bit of inspiration? Where do you go for that sort of colour and that enthusiasm?
Well, apart from public transport
And
and,
pubs.
and eavesdropping pubs, it's always books. So reading other people's work always makes me want to write.
And yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say that's the you've do you sort of feel that it influences your style and the stories that you tell?
No, I just love, like, it could be really, really different. Like I'm saying about like the stuff I have to read now for the competition, which may not be my kind of thing at all. But if I'm really enjoying it, it's really pacey. Um, that just makes me that just makes me excited about literature and want to produce my own. It can
And
be something, it can be really like completely different, sometimes even poetry. And I mean, I'm not a poet, but if I read a really good poem, it can sometimes make me want to write really good fiction.
do you remember the moment when you decided you'd be a writer? I know we've talked about influence and your teachers and your grandmother, but was there a moment, a light bulb moment?
So you know what we were talking about earlier about the characters, a lot of the characters in Fresh Apples would tell themselves stories to cope. I was always telling myself I was a writer. I would be a writer. And I tell other people as well, but I don't think I really believed it um, until my first novel won a prize, and that kind of gave me permission and like validation. Um, and then I thought, okay, oh maybe I am then.
The original imposter syndrome moment.
Yeah,
You still live with that now?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it never goes away.
I have so many questions, but the clock has unfortunately beaten us, and I don't think we're going to have any time to go through any more questions. But I'm sure you'll agree. Great questions from the audience. Thank you to
Yeah.
everybody who wrote in to send them to us. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Very grateful. I always panic that nobody's going to send these questions, so the Hey audience never disappoint. As I said right at the beginning of this evening, the book club, the wonderful book club, is hosted obviously on a monthly basis. April's selection, as I said, was Metamorphosis by Kafka. So next month, please do sign up. The book is available on the Hay Festival website. And while you're on the website, and Rachel, I'm sure you'll nod and agree with me here, the programme for this year's events in Hay on Wye are there too. So lots of amazing things planned for the end of May and June. I don't need to tell you twice. Tickets are currently available, so don't dilly-dally for too long because they won't be there for too long. Go and have a little look to see if you'd like to sign up for anything. And Rachel, the final word to you. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so, so much for your time and for your generosity of spirit. I think I speak for everyone who's joined us this evening when I say you've been fabulous. Diolch yn fawr.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.